Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Workers in Britain are living through a squeeze in their standard of living, the likes of which hasn't been seen for 70 years. That's the stark verdict from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which has been analysing yesterday's autumn statement. The IFS says people will earn less in real wages in 2021 than they did in 2008. But Theresa May says she's helping families on low incomes with initiatives such as increasing the minimum wage and raising tax allowances. Here's our economics editor, Kamal Ahmed.
Fixing the economy, it's tougher than you think. After the gloomy economic forecast yesterday, new analysis today which showed that incomes are facing another squeeze. At a garage in Wolverhampton, it's clear that life is far from comfortable.
Each month is a struggle for me. I can pay the bills, but obviously there's not enough things for luxury things like going out myself or treating my family.
Things are not getting or not looking rosier, and as I say, we have tightened our belt as a family over the last few years, and we've got to tighten it even more now. They all level okay.
For Wolverhampton, read Britain, incomes across the country are stagnant.
This has for sure been the worst decade for living standards, certainly since the last war and probably since the 1920s. We've seen no increase so far in average incomes, and it doesn't look like we're going to see much of an increase over the next 4 or 5 years either.
Let's look at how incomes have changed since the financial crisis in 2007. If we take the average for everyone, incomes have increased by just 2%. That's compared to 13% the decade before. And some groups have not even fared that well. For younger people, those are aged 22 to 30, incomes are still 7% lower than nearly 10 years ago. They suffered most from unemployment and wage squeezes. Contrast that with the over 60s. Their incomes, they're up 11%. Pensions have risen rapidly. Now, let's look at the effects of the benefits freeze and rising inflation. In March, it was forecast the poorest groups, that's the groups down there, would be up to £280 a year worse off by 2020. But following yesterday's gloomy forecast, poorer groups could now find themselves up to £390 a year worse off. Not the best news for the two people who pledged the economy would work for everyone. The PM and the Chancellor visiting an engineering firm in Gloucestershire, making the point the government is investing in high technology innovation.
We're helping people in a variety of ways. Of course, that includes raising the national living wage. It includes raising personal tax allowance, which will take more people out of paying tax altogether and give a tax cut to people. And of course, we're committed to building more affordable homes. But what matters underneath all of this is ensuring that we have a strong economy.
For the PM's opponents, it's time to change direction.
The austerity politics of the last 6 years has simply not worked. The deficit is greater, the debt is greater, the need for investment is desperate and has not been properly met by the autumn statement yesterday, and living standards are being squeezed as a result of that.
Working hard, but there's no more money. The government's task now to focus on skills and infrastructure and attempt to create economic wealth that politicians hope can be shared by everyone. Kamal Ahmed, BBC News.
Live now to Westminster and our political editor, Laura Koonsberg. Laura, we all remember Theresa May's commitment to low-income families. How damaging is this latest analysis?
Well, George, let's do the health warning first. You know, these are very well-educated guesses, but they are forecasts and not things that are certain. Let's be clear about that. These numbers could change when reality actually happens. That said, they will give the government real pause for thought. It's a grim backdrop for what they want to do, because let's make no bones about it, there are millions of voters around the country who think they've been putting more in than they get back. people who think that the economy is not working for them and that the country isn't fair. And it's that group that Theresa May herself defined as those who are just about managing. And if you believe today's figures, well, the just about managing are going to be just about skint for a lot longer. That's particularly tricky for the Prime Minister because she's made it her very public mission to make it look like she's helping them to try to improve the country for them so they get more reward. And more broadly, it's also difficult for the Conservatives. At the last election, voters were told, choose them because they're the ones who the economy is safe with. They're the ones who will return us to the good times. Looking at what's being sketched out today, that is anything but. And voters don't reward politicians who make them feel hard up. They tend to punish them instead.
Laura, thank you. The Chancellor also faced criticism today for not addressing the issue of social care in the autumn statement. NHS managers have been urging the government to announce new investment for councils who run the service in England. Previous cuts to funding have been blamed for delays to patients being discharged from hospitals. The Prime Minister says money has already been pledged to help social care by 2020. Our health editor, Hugh Pym, reports.
The human cost of social care delays. Barbara is medically well enough to leave hospital, but no nursing home place has been available. So as her husband explains, she's stuck where she is.
She was declared fit for discharge 3 weeks ago, but nowhere to go. So she's had to stay in hospital.
My understanding is that we have a discharge date.
Here at Ipswich Hospital, they work with the local authority and other community groups, trying to ensure patients can be moved as swiftly as possible. They're making some progress. But the Chief Executive told me there were still major problems.
It's unprecedented. I've never seen the numbers of delays right across the system in both health and social care. So regularly we'll see 2 or 3 wards with patients who are unable to go home.
Most health leaders had accepted that the NHS was unlikely to get more money in the autumn statement. They had called for and hoped for extra investment in social care to try to take the pressure off hospitals. But that didn't happen. For adult social care spending in England, experts predict a gap between money available and what's needed. Services are already overstretched this year, with a funding gap of £1 billion predicted by April. With demand for care increasing, the gap's projected to rise to £1.9 billion next year, and even further in 2018-19 to £2.2 billion, reaching £2.3 billion before the end of this Parliament. There had been calls for local authorities to be given powers to raise more money from council tax or cash already allocated to be brought forward. The Prime Minister defended the government's record and hinted there might yet be further action.
By the end of this Parliament, local authorities will have £3.5 billion more to spend on social care. And of course, we're putting more money into the health service as well. But we need to see the health service and social care working together. And that's why the Health Secretary and the Communities Secretary are praised of the need for the challenges that are being faced and are looking at this issue.
Michael, who's had a hip replacement, did leave Ipswich Hospital today. He's been moved to a community facility to continue his recovery. The major challenge across the NHS right now is ensuring the process is always as straightforward as this. Hugh Pym, BBC News, Ipswich.
So the sustained decline in real wages since the 2008 financial crash is the worst Britain has experienced since the war and possibly in the last 100 years. That is the conclusion of the influential think tank, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. The IFS says that yesterday's autumn statement would mean that by 2021, real wages would be below their level of 13 years before. The analysis came as pro-Brexit MPs accused economists of promoting a doom and gloom scenario, which was out of line with reality. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, has this.
Families struggling on a tight budget. Theresa May said they were her priority. But trawling through the figures from yesterday's autumn statement, think tanks believe we're heading for an extraordinary extended period of wage stagnation. The Institute for Fiscal Studies says 5 years from now, real wages will still be below their 2008 level, something the country's very rarely seen before.
I can't stress enough how extraordinary and dreadful that is. To have more than a decade with no real wage growth is certainly something we haven't seen in the last 70 years and quite possibly in the last 100.
Another think tank says you have to go back even further to the very beginning of the 20th century to find the last time Britain plummeted into zero growth in earnings. The heyday in average earnings growth was the 1950s, but after decades of consistent growth, yesterday's official projections suggest living standards could be stagnant for years ahead.
The new outlook suggests that the decade we're currently in, real wages after you adjust for prices basically won't grow at all. That hasn't happened for a century, maybe more.
Number 10 hit back, focusing on disposable incomes, including benefits and pensions, which they said would rise in this Parliament.
What matters underneath all of this is ensuring that we have a strong economy. That's what the autumn statement was about yesterday, ensuring that we have a strong economy and that we're investing in the economy for the future. That means jobs for people for the future.
For many, inflation fed by a lower pound is already meaning they're feeling pinched.
Well, it hasn't gone down, but it's just been flat and inflation's going up and prices are rising, so yeah, effectively down. So yeah, not great.
I have noticed that even freelancing, what you can earn is pushed down all the time.
And if I were to say that's going to continue in the sort of medium term, I mean, forecasters are saying it's going to go on and possibly even get worse, what would you say?
I think there'll be a revolution.
You spoil us, Ambassador. Last night at a Brexit victory party at the London Ritz Hotel, Nigel Farage was presented with Ferrero Rocher chocolates, a joke on Donald Trump's tweet suggesting Mr Farage should be Britain's man in Washington. Nigel Farage warned his supporters that economic doomsayers and the political elite were trying to frustrate Brexit. And on cue, Tony Blair, in an interview in the New Statesman, said,
"It can be stopped if the British people decide that, having seen what it means, the pain-gain cost-benefit analysis doesn't stack up."
That gloomy forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility is actually based on a growth forecast that's a bit better than the one that an awful lot of other outfits are putting around, including the Bank of England, which raises the prospect that the future might be even bleaker than they predict. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News, Westminster.
So the IFS is predicting that workers will earn less in real wages in 2021 than they did in 2008. Just a day after a budget that was supposed to help families who are just about managing, the so-called jams, the IFS analysis has cast new doubt on whether it'll really make any difference. Cathy Newman has been to Wolverhampton to meet people running their own businesses, but who are desperately trying to make ends meet.
For those struggling to make ends meet, yesterday's autumn statement wasn't able to promise much. There was little hope for people like cafe owner Alex, who's worked hard for 30 years, but says he's hardly keeping his head above water.
We're just about managing, and maybe sometimes you're not managing. You have to dig deeper in the well to find if there is any water left, really.
So you feel like you're working yourself to the bone?
To the absolute limitation, to the absolute limit, whatever it can take, try to just earn a living.
Alex and his daughter Jasmine opened their cafe 2 months ago, and as the economy falters, so too have their takings. Alex voted to leave the European Union, believing they'd be better off.
Hearing you talk, it's really clear that there's been quite a lot of disappointment. You know, you've worked so hard and it's been quite a struggle. How did that all feed into your decision to vote for Brexit?
Brexit is the best thing for the future to happen, because Britain is giving in. That money was going in Europe, so much of it. If that's spent within the country, you're not going to have homeless people. You're not going to have old people watching to spend the money on heating. We see things which shouldn't be seen in Britain at all.
Jasmine didn't vote in the EU referendum. She's happy the UK is leaving, but she does worry about the plunging pound and rising costs.
With us, it's obviously buying things like stock and equipment. So if things like that go up, obviously, we would struggle.
We need somebody to stand there and say, that's what we're going to do, that's how we're going to do, that's we're going to back you up, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. But this is not happening.
Do you trust Theresa May to do that in the end?
We don't know her. I mean, really, she needs to come out, help us out.
Just up the street, Janet too is barely managing, despite working desperately hard. Janet spent many years on disability benefits after suffering from a brain tumour. Now she's set up her own business. She dreams of making it a success, but the reality is a real struggle.
At the end of each month, I'm probably left with probably about £100.
And that's, you have enough to sort of eat well during the month, or would you say you really scrimp on that?
Well, I would say you scrimp. Beans on toast 6 nights a week. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Are you better off in work than you were on benefits, or not?
Financially, no. Mentally, yes.
Is that worth it, the financial knock, for your mental
yes.
well-being?
Oh, yes.
Where do you hope you'll be in 5, 10 years' time?
Well, certainly not on the scrap heap. Certainly not, whatever it takes.
Well, now, earlier I spoke to Lord Jim O'Neill, the former Goldman Sachs chief economist. He took a post as Treasury Minister under George Osborne to push through the Northern Powerhouse plan, but resigned in September. I asked him if he accepted that the idea that people who were just managing needed help from the government.
The big net losers of policy the past decade plus are actually the higher income groups, because their taxes have been increased a lot. And as I say, if you look at something like the so-called Gini coefficient...
But that flies absolutely in the face of the feeling in the country, which is that the rich have got richer and the poor, if anything, have either stayed the same or got poorer.
Yeah, as I say to you...
And you think it's not true?
I'm pretty sure it's not true. If you include wealth, which of course is primarily driven by house ownership, then it does become true. But if you just look at income, pre and post-tax, it's not actually been true the past decade or so.
Why does the government feel it needs to address it?
We live in a world of where technology gives this enormous voice to anybody, which, generally speaking, is, of course, a good thing. And with it, we have policymakers that live in the same 24/7 world that like to appear reactive and responsive to you know, big, sudden voices.
When people feel hard done by, they look for people to blame.
Yeah, of course.
And it's not the government
Which
they blame.
is quite rational.
They blame people of other races, they blame immigrants, whereas in actual fact, what a lot of people are saying is it is globalisation, it's automation, it's digitalisation, which all in and of themselves may be good things, but they've left an awful lot of people behind.
I wish we had days to discuss this. Globalisation on a true global basis has and is still currently taking hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. If you look at how these things are accurately measured and not emotionally based, we are probably living through right now the biggest decline in global inequality there has ever been.
But that is obviously a plus side of globalisation.
It's an enormous plus.
A lot of places where obviously labour is cheap, cars are being made, things are being manufactured. But the point is that the people who used to manufacture them in America, in Britain, don't manufacture them any longer, and they have not found a kind of way of life that is going to produce the same income that it did before.
So that is true, but for that to simply mean that globalisation is the culprit, I think is a very dangerous and worrying conclusion for policymakers to jump on the back of.
It doesn't need to be the culprit if government intervenes to ensure that people are retrained, re-educated, given another opportunity. And that does not happen.
So the key issues in that regard are the interplay of globalisation with the use of and the application of technology, and crucially, labour market policy and skills training. And one of the reasons why, of course, I became so passionate and why I actually joined government was to drive the so-called Northern Powerhouse, because I sort of realised that something like that is so vital.
And do you derive some comfort from yesterday's autumn statement? They are returning in some degree to believing in the Northern Powerhouse.
I mean, I wish there would have been more on it, because I think it's so important.
Do you think your resignation is what actually provoked them in the end to get back to it? Well, it's not a bad question.
I don't think my importance was
Well,
or is
come on,
that
you
big.
were, but did you resign because of it?
No, I resigned because I'm not a member of any political party, and I knew that there would be a limit to how much time I could be prepared to give to the very demanding aspects of life as a minister in the House of Lords.
So what wasn't Hinkley Point and the Chinese as well and all that?
You know, there's no two ways about it. There was a number of issues that I had differences with the new leadership on policy, but the reason why I decided to leave was because of the sheer demand of sitting around the House of Lords waiting for a possible vote, you know, every other day.
Jim O'Neill, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Philip Hammond, new to autumn statements, has today been learning the lesson many chancellors before him have discovered the hard way, that economic figures you deliver which seem to go down well one day have a habit of coming back to bite you the day after. And that's pretty much what's happened since his autumn statement yesterday. After a forensic scan of the Chancellor's economic report, the respected Institute of Fiscal Studies delivered some pretty alarming conclusions. It said the figures showed we are now facing the worst living standards in real terms for almost 70 years, possibly even a century, and predicted in 5 years' time wages will still be below where they were before the financial crash. That's 13 years without real earnings growing at all, while prices carry on rising.
It's the biggest squeeze on real incomes since the war. In real terms, earnings growth is as bad now as it was then. Of course, the overall standard of living is much higher today, but even the normally cautious director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies had this to say about earnings growth.
I can't stress enough how extraordinary and dreadful that is. To have more than a decade with no real wage growth is certainly something you haven't seen in the last 70 years and quite possibly in the last 100.
Real average earnings have yet to return to 2008 pre-economic crash levels. But in March, forecasters predicted that would happen in 2021. But now wages are expected to rise more slowly and inflation is expected to rise more quickly, meaning that in real terms, average earnings will still be worth less in 2021 than they were in 2008. How much of this can we lay at the door of that decision to leave the European Union?
Things have been really quite bad for the last 7 or 8 years. This isn't new. Going forward, the downgrading in the forecast relative to where we were in March mean that we'll be earning 3 or 4% less in 2020, and most of that downgrading comes from that decision to leave the European Union.
Umesh Rachada voted for Brexit, concerned for his family's future.
3 minus X is Y, yeah? That's not going to teach you anything in life.
He also considers himself just about managing and so worries about his income flatlining.
Very upset, very worried and not sure how we're going to cope because inflation's going to be going up as well. Cost of living's going up. It's just a matter of balancing the books and I'm worried. I really am worried, you know. I really wish the government could get their act together.
But the government doesn't have too many levers it can pull to speed up wage growth. The infrastructure spending announced by the Chancellor yesterday could take decades to have an impact, so they're looking for other solutions for people like Umesh.
We're helping people in a variety of ways. Of course, that includes raising the national living wage. It includes raising personal tax allowance, which will take more people out of paying tax altogether and give a tax cut to people. And, of course, we're committed to building more affordable homes.
But you can expect the opposition to double down on that income problem.
Most households over the past 6 years have lost money compared to the retail price index or compared to the cost of living in general. £3,500 per household. That has to change.
So this income stagnation could set the terms of the debate here for years to come. Trying to fix it could also be a long-term project. Carl Dinnan, News at 10.
We'll be returning to Carl in Downing Street in just a moment for his assessment of how this looks for the government. But first, let's talk to our economics editor, Narina Hertz, who's here with me in the studio. Narina, wages aren't going up. Why? Is it because of Brexit, do you think?
No, I want to be clear. We cannot blame wage stagnation entirely on Brexit. Brexit will, of course, play a part because of rising inflation and lower business investment. But there is something else at play here. The United States, France, most developed countries have seen their wage levels recover since the financial crisis. But here in the UK, we haven't.
Why?
Well, part of the reason is because what we saw after the financial crisis was a dramatic shift towards lower paid jobs, zero-hour contracts, part-time workers who wanted full-time work, whilst those who earn less have found it ever harder to find jobs that pay more. Now, maybe the Chancellor has sought to address this with his investment in research and science that he announced yesterday. But for that to fundamentally change the nature of our workforce would take years, and also far more than the 4.7 billion that he's committed.
So who's hit hardest then, in terms of these very grim assessments?
The poorest in society, because they're going to be hit not only by Brexit, but also by Philip Hammond's decision not to reverse George Osborne's welfare cuts. I'm thinking here of groups like single parents who are working but aren't earning that much and so need to supplement their income with benefits. And you know who make up the vast majority of such a group? Women. 86% of single parents are women. It's women who will disproportionately suffer.
OK, Narina, thanks very much for your assessment. Back to Carl now at Downing Street. Carl, you heard what Narina had to say, but, I mean, what does this do for the government? Because they've talked endlessly about those who are just about managing. That's what Theresa May said she wanted to address when she walked into Downing Street. How damaging is it for her and her government?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It makes it very, very difficult for them, because ever since Theresa May stood just over there and gave her very first speech as Prime Minister, the just about managing were central to what she wanted to do. Now, this makes it more difficult for the government to address their concerns, even though today the Conservative Party said, look, living standards aren't the same as real-term wages, and living standards are as high as they've ever been. If you're just about managing, I'm not sure how much ice that will really cut. And look, I think this could possibly feed into a much bigger scenario here as well, because the enormous political earthquakes that we've seen this year, such as Brexit, were in some large part fueled by those people who feel like the system hasn't been working for them. And if they now find that they've got another 4 or 5 years where their wages aren't getting any higher in real terms, they're going to be looking for someone else who can help. And that provides an opportunity to so-called insurgent parties like UKIP or possibly Labour if they can put together a strong enough offer. One warning about all this, of course, it's all based on predictions, and the IFS said things could turn out better, although they did also say things could turn out worse.
All right, Carl in Downing Street, thank you very much indeed for that, Carl.